If you grew up here in the United States, maybe you remember sitting in elementary school flipping through a textbook and seeing a giant world map on the wall, and maybe you felt a little swell of pride when you saw Africa on it, even if you couldn't explain why. But what if I told you the map you grew up looking at was lying to you? Welcome back to another episode of They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numba, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. Today's episode is actually part of two of our series, Reclaiming the African Story and Africa Now. Reclaiming the African Story is where we correct the lies, distortions, and stereotypes about our continent that have shaped how the world, and even we ourselves, see Africa. Africa Now is where we spotlight the stories, debates, and movements happening across the continent today that are shaping its future in real time. So let's start with what's actually happening right now. The African Union just backed a global campaign called Correct the Map, and it's all over the media because it's the first time Africa's leaders have said, yo, the way the world draws Africa has to change. And here's why. For centuries, we've been looking at the Mercator projection, that rectangular world map you probably remember from your classroom wall. And here's the catch. Mercator was made in the 1500s for sailors, not students. It's great for navigation, but terrible for reality. It shrinks countries near the equator like Africa and South America and blows up Europe and North America so they look way bigger than they actually are. Now, the AU is saying enough. They want schools, textbooks, and even global institutions to switch to something called the Equal Earth Map. It's an equal area projection, which basically means countries show up at their real size. It's not perfect, no flat map ever really is, but it finally gives Africa the space it deserves. And when you see it, the difference is wild. Africa is actually bigger than the US, China, India, and most of Europe combined. And here's what I find just a little interesting and why I wanted to make this episode in the first place. This whole story isn't just about geography. It's about how we see ourselves. If you grow up staring at a map where Africa looks small and Europe looks huge, that legitimately shapes your mindset, whether you realize it or not. That's why this campaign is blowing up right now. It's a reminder that maps are not neutral and that representation matters, even on paper. Okay, so let's rewind. Where did this map even come from? The Mercator projection was created in 1569 by a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator. At the time, people weren't worried about classroom maps or Google Earth. They were worried about sailing. So Mercator essentially wanted to make navigation easier for sailors crossing oceans, right? But here's how it worked. On his projection, a straight line drawn between 2 points matches a constant compass direction. That's huge if like you're a sailor trying to get from Europe to the Americas. But to make the math work, Mercator had to stretch the map vertically, especially near the poles. And that's where the distortion comes in. Now, here's what's important. Mercator did not set out to shrink Africa on purpose. I hope that y'all keep that in mind. His goal wasn't political at the time, it was just practical. But the side effects was that the equatorial regions got squished smaller and the polar regions got blown up bigger. That means that Africa, South America, India, and Southeast Asia all look way tinier than they actually are. And on the flip side, Europe, North America, Canada, and especially Greenland look enormous. You want a mind-blowing example? On the Mercator map, Greenland looks just as big as Africa, but in real life, Africa is about 14 times larger than Greenland. Africa covers around 30 million square kilometers, and Greenland? Barely 2 million. Yet when you see them side by side on Mercator, you'd think they were actually equals, or even that Greenland was way bigger. And that's the thing about maps. To take a 3D globe and flatten it out onto a rectangle, you have to stretch something, right? Logically speaking. So before Mercator, there were actually other maps, like maps from ancient Greece or medieval TO maps, but they weren't practical for navigation. Mercator's version worked for sailors, but the distortion became the default worldview. So while the intention was not to minimize Africa, the result was actually that. A continent that is physically massive, diverse, and resource rich was already drawn smaller than it actually is. So if we've known this map was distorted for centuries, why did we keep it? This is where politics and power comes in. So by the 1800s, colonizers were not using maps just to sail. They were using them to shape the world's imagination, and the Mercator projection happened to do something very convenient for Europe. It made Europe and North America look bigger, more central, more important, and it made Africa and South America look smaller and more marginal. Even after equal area maps existed, maps that showed Africa's true size, the Mercator stayed in classrooms, atlases, and government offices. Not because it was the most accurate for teaching, but because it was the most flattering for colonial powers. And think about it, if Africa had been shown in its true size all along, would that map have been hanging in every classroom? Probably not, because a giant Africa dominating the wall would have forced kids in Europe, America, and even Africa itself to ask questions that colonial powers didn't want answered. So, no, Mercator didn't intentionally shrink Africa in 1569, but colonial governments intentionally kept it that way. Keeping Africa small on paper reinforced the same story they were telling in real life, that Europe was powerful and Africa was peripheral. And once you realize that, you see how even a classroom map is never neutral. It's always telling you who matters and who doesn't. I even remember being a kid, like looking up at the classroom wall and seeing Africa on that big world map. So even if I didn't have the words for it back then, I felt a little swell of pride, like I mentioned in the beginning. Like, that's where my family is from. That's where my name comes from. That's where the people who look like me come from. But here's the problem, the map itself was lying, and we were being taught to believe that lie. We were taught that Europe and North America were the centers of the world. Every map we saw in school placed them right in the middle, stretched out huge. Meanwhile, Africa, the continent that birthed humanity, the continent with over 1 billion people, endless languages, resources, and cultures, was drawn small, pushed to the margins. We were taught to memorize countries like France, Germany, and England, but many of us never even got lessons on the borders of Africa, borders that were drawn by those same European powers during colonization. We were taught to associate size with importance. Bigger countries on the map looked more powerful, more developed, more modern, and smaller countries looked less relevant, less advanced. And without even saying it out loud, those maps reinforced the story that Africa was somehow less. And that's the danger. Distorted maps create distorted perceptions, and distorted perceptions lead to real world actions. If you grow up thinking Africa is small, it's easier to underestimate it, to dismiss it, or to ignore its potential. But the truth is, Africa is massive. It's literally bigger than the US, China, India, and most of Europe combined. When you see that reality on an equal area map, it forces you to confront how much we've been miseducated, and it reminds us that the representation is never neutral. Not in textbooks, not in classrooms, and not even on the walls where we learned our first ideas of the world. And this is where it all comes together, because if we spent our childhoods looking at a map that lied to us about Africa's size, what else were we taught to believe? We were taught that Africa was small, not just on paper, but in value. That Europe and North America were the centers and progress of modernity. That Africa was developing, always behind, always catching up. We were taught to look outward for opportunity and inward for only pity. But the truth, we've inherited both the lies and the opportunities. The lies were the distortions, the maps, the textbooks, the lessons that minimize Africa's role in history. But the opportunities are the access, the education, the resources that we now have in the diaspora. We carry the privilege of mobility, language, and knowledge. So the real question is, what do we do with both? Because if the world lied to us about Africa being small, then it's our job to tell the truth. If the world distorted our vision of the continent, then it's our job to correct it. Not just on maps, but in business, technology, and media, in every place where Africa deserves to be seen at its true scale. And here's the part that blows my mind. There has never been a more important time to invest in Africa than right now. The continent has the youngest population in the world, like I mentioned, over 60% under the age of 25. And that's not just a statistic, that's energy, creativity, and labor wanting to be unlocked. And by 2050, like I mentioned before, 1 in 4 people on this planet will be African. Imagine like the markets, the music, the innovation, the cultural influence, the sheer force of that. And yet, so much of that potential goes untapped because we were taught to believe that Africa was small. That's why diaspora entrepreneurship matters. Starting a business, building a program, creating a platform. It's not just about making money, it's about rewriting that narrative. Every factory opened, every app launched, every school built says Africa is not small, Africa is powerful, and Africa is the future. You don't necessarily have to relocate all the way to Africa. You can build something here in the United States inspired by Africa to really bring that representation into the spotlight. Or you can go back, but take your time with it too, because you have a home here, which is completely valid. So with everything we have here, the jobs, the degrees, the connections, isn't it only fair that we give back, that we build, create, reclaim, uplift, and manage what was diminished? Because this is bigger than geography. It's about identity, about power, whether we're going to let the old lies shape us or whether we are going to take the pen and write our own story. So I want to leave you with this. If a map could lie to us for centuries and we accepted it without question, what else might we be carrying that isn't true? I can think of a million other things, but I need you to think about it, okay? And how much power do we gain when we finally decide to see Africa and ourselves as massive, essential, and unstoppable? All right, y'all, that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, for learning, for tuning in and reclaiming these stories with me. If this opened your eyes even a little bit, I've got more episodes waiting for you. So go check them out. And if you want to dig into the receipts yourself, the articles I used to put this episode together are all linked in the description box of this episode or YouTube video, wherever you're watching. Just hit the link tree and you'll see all the sources there. And about subscribing, I'm not going to hit you with the basic smash that like button line. And let's be honest, if you just found out Greenland is not bigger than Africa and you walk away without subscribing, that's like closing your textbook before the teacher says, quiz tomorrow. Don't do that. Subscribing just means you'll always catch the next story they didn't want you to know. So, follow along, share this with that cousin or friend who thinks they know everything, and join me again next time because if nobody told you the real story, I will.